My name is Layla Fontaine. I'm 34 years old. And I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I'm not bitter. I am not broken. And I am absolutely not asking for your sympathy. What I am asking for is your attention, because what my parents did to me when I was 18 years old, and what they had the nerve to come back and ask for 14 years later, is the kind of story that makes you question everything you think you know about family, about loyalty, and about the price of a spotless reputation. My parents threw me out of their house the week before Christmas. I was 18, 8 weeks pregnant and carrying a secret that my mother said would, quote, burn everything we've worked for to the ground. She meant her reputation. She meant the Fontaine name. She meant the carefully constructed image of perfection she had spent decades polishing like silver she never actually used. They didn't just kick me out. They called their lawyer. They had papers drawn up. Official, notarized, ironclad documents stripping me of any claim to the family estate and making clear that the Fontaine family bore no responsibility for me or, and I want you to hear this, any child I might bring into the world. They erased me on paper before I even had a chance to fail them in person. I kept those papers. Every single page. 14 years later, my mother showed up at my door in a white linen blazer, smiling like we'd spoken last Tuesday, asking to meet my daughter. The daughter she'd legally erased before she was born. The daughter she'd spent years telling her church friends, her garden club, her entire social circle, had been given up for adoption to a good family. Except my daughter wasn't given up. My daughter was sitting in the next room doing her homework. And my mother had no idea what was about to happen when she walked through my front door and realized that the story she'd been telling for 14 years was about to collapse in real time. If you're new here and stories like this one are what you came for, hit that subscribe button right now because we post every week, and trust me, this one is only getting started. My name is Layla Fontaine. I grew up in Belhaven, South Carolina, in a 4-bedroom colonial on Wisteria Lane, which is exactly as suffocating as it sounds. My father, Gerald Fontaine, was a partner at a regional accounting firm that had managed the finances of half the old money families in the county for 30 years. My mother, Patricia Fontaine, was the kind of woman who ironed her pillowcases and considered a smudged window a personal failure. Together they were the picture of respectable Southern success, and from the time I was old enough to understand what that meant, I understood that maintaining that picture was the most important thing in our household. More important than honesty. More important than warmth. More important, as it turned out, than me. I was the youngest of 2 children. My brother Colton was 4 years older. Pre-law at Clemson, golden-haired and golden-tongued and completely fluent in the language of giving my parents exactly what they wanted. Colton knew how to walk into a room and make my father stand a little straighter with pride. He knew which stories to tell at dinner and which ones to leave at the door. He was, in every sense my mother valued, the perfect Fontaine. And then there was me. I wasn't difficult, not really. I made decent grades. I stayed out of serious trouble. I had friends my mother approved of and wore the right kind of clothes to the right kind of events. But there was always something slightly off about me in her eyes, some frequency I broadcast that she couldn't quite tune out. I asked too many questions. I laughed too loudly. I once told a family friend at a dinner party that I thought debutante culture was outdated, and my mother didn't speak to me directly for 4 days. The message was never spoken out loud, but I heard it clearly from the time I was 12. Don't embarrass us, Layla. Don't be the thing that makes people talk. I met Daniel Reyes the summer before my senior year of high school at a photography workshop hosted by the Community Arts Center downtown. He was 20, attending the local community college while working part-time at his family's landscaping business. He was quiet and funny and saw the world through a lens that made ordinary things look worth stopping for. My mother would have hated him on sight, which is probably part of why I fell so hard so fast. We dated in the careful, hidden way that teenagers date when they know the relationship would not survive parental scrutiny. Stolen afternoons at the art center. Drives down to the waterfront after dark. A relationship built in the margins of my real life, which looking back tells you everything about how trapped I already felt inside it. I found out I was pregnant in October of my senior year. I was 18, technically an adult, though nothing about the moment I stared at that test in my bathroom felt remotely adult. My hands were shaking. My mind was running every possible version of what came next, and in every single version my mother's face appeared, and it was not a kind face. Daniel didn't flinch. When I told him, sitting on the hood of his truck at the edge of Belhaven Park, he reached over and took my hand and said, "Whatever you want to do, I'm here for it." He meant it. I knew he meant it. But I also knew that what I wanted and what my parents would allow were two entirely different things, and I was still living under their roof, still dependent on them for everything, still 18 years old with no savings and no plan. I told my parents on a Sunday evening in early December. I had rehearsed it 17 times. I told myself I would stay calm. I told myself maybe they would surprise me. My mother was arranging a centerpiece on the dining room table when I walked in. My father was reading the paper by the window. It was a perfectly normal Sunday evening and I was about to end it. Dad, I need to tell you something. My mother set down a sprig of holly and looked at me with that particular stillness she had, the kind that meant she was already calculating before you finished the sentence. I'm pregnant. The holly sprig fell to the floor. My father folded his newspaper with the slow, deliberate precision of a man who needed something to do with his hands. My mother's face didn't crumble. It didn't soften. It went hard and smooth as ceramic, and when she spoke, her voice was so controlled it didn't even sound like anger. It sounded like a decision already made. Who is the father? His name is Daniel. He works for his family's landscaping company. My father looked up for the first time. He's not from Belhaven. Is he one of the Reyes boys from over on County Road? Sir. Another silence. The kind that has weight. My mother turned away from me and walked to the window, and I watched her standing there, looking out at the front lawn, and I understood with absolute clarity that she was not thinking about me. She was thinking about the Hendersons next door and the women in her garden club and the Sunday school class she taught at First Presbyterian and what all of them would say. My father spoke first. You will not keep it. Just like that. Not a question. Not a discussion. A directive, delivered the same way he might instruct a junior accountant to fix a ledger error. My mother turned back from the window. We'll make arrangements. There's a clinic in Columbia. We'll handle this quietly. There will be no disruption to your college plans. I want to keep the baby. The room went very still. I looked at both of them, these two people who had raised me, and I said it again because I needed them to actually hear it. I want to keep this baby and I want Daniel to be part of our lives. My mother closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, she looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into her house and started rearranging the furniture. Then you will not stay in this house. Her voice was iron. This family has a name in this community. A name that your grandfather built and your father has maintained for 30 years. I will not watch you drag it through the mud because you made a reckless decision and now want everyone else to pay the consequences. That's not how this family works. My father didn't argue with her. He never argued with her about the things that mattered to her most. He just nodded once and went back to his newspaper, and that single nod was the loneliest thing I have ever witnessed in my life. By 9 o'clock that night, I was standing on the front porch with a duffel bag and a tote full of books and the kind of cold that gets inside your coat no matter how tightly you pull it. Belhaven in December smells like wood smoke and river water. I stood on that porch for a long time after the door closed, just breathing it in, trying to understand that this was actually happening. My brother Colton watched from the upstairs hallway. I saw his shadow through the window. He didn't come down. He didn't open the door. He just watched, and then he was gone and the light went out and I was alone. I called Daniel from the gas station on Merchant Street. He picked up on the first ring. He was at my side within 20 minutes and he held me in the parking lot of that gas station while I cried until I had nothing left. Then he put my bags in his truck and he drove me to his mother's house, and that is where my real life began. Rosa Reyes was not what I expected. I had built her up in my mind during that 20-minute drive, constructed some version of a woman who would open the door, look me up and down and see exactly what my mother had seen. A problem. An inconvenience. A girl who had made a mess and was now depositing that mess on someone else's doorstep at 9:30 on a December night. Instead, she opened the door before Daniel even knocked, like she had been listening for his truck, and she looked at me, this woman with flour on her apron and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she said, "You must be Layla. Come inside before you freeze." That was it. No interrogation. No visible calculation. Just come inside. I slept in Daniel's sister's room that first night, in a twin bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar and fabric softener, and I lay there in the dark listening to the sounds of a house that was nothing like the one I had grown up in, and I cried so quietly I didn't even recognize the sound as crying at first. It felt more like something leaving me. Some last version of the life I had imagined I would have, slipping out through the walls of that small warm room and disappearing into the Belhaven night. Daniel's family didn't have money. I want to be honest about that because it matters to the story. Rosa worked the front desk at a dental office and picked up weekend shifts at a diner on Route 9. His father had passed 3 years earlier. His older sister Marisol had her own apartment across town and a toddler of her own. The Reyes house was a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of Belhaven, the part of town my mother referred to as over there, as if geography itself carried moral weight. They had less than my family by every measure Patricia Fontaine used to calculate human worth. And they were kinder to me in that first week than my parents had been in 18 years. I stayed with Rosa for 6 weeks. Daniel and I talked constantly about what came next, about the baby, about our options, about the future and all its terrifying shapelessness. He wanted to get a place together. I wanted that too, but I also knew I needed to finish my senior year, needed my diploma at minimum, needed some kind of foundation beneath my feet before I could start building anything real. Rosa drove me to school every morning for those 6 weeks, never once making me feel like a burden, never once letting me see on her face whatever fear or worry she must have felt about the situation her son had landed them all in. My parents, meanwhile, had already begun constructing the replacement narrative. I know this because Colton texted me 3 weeks after they threw me out. It was a short message. Just wanted you to know Mom told the Hendersons you took a gap year abroad. Photography program in Europe. Dad backed her up. I stared at that message for a long time. A gap year. A photography program. They had taken the one real thing Daniel and I had shared, the workshop where we met, and turned it into the story they needed me to be. I didn't respond to Colton. I saved the message. My daughter, Ivy Rose Fontaine Reyes, was born on July 14th at Belhaven Regional Medical Center. 6 pounds, 11 ounces, with her father's dark eyes and a voice that announced her arrival like she had been waiting her whole life for this moment and was not about to let anyone miss it. I was 19 years old. I had a high school diploma I'd collected 3 weeks earlier and $400 in a savings account, and a woman who wasn't my mother holding my hand through the hardest part. Rosa was in that delivery room because Daniel asked her to be there and because I had no one else to ask. My own mother was 40 minutes away in a 4-bedroom colonial on Wisteria Lane, probably hosting her garden club, probably telling someone over iced tea that her youngest was thriving in Europe. Holding Ivy for the first time, I made 2 decisions. The first was that she would always know the truth. Not a softened version, not a child-appropriate approximation, but the real truth, delivered age by age as she grew into it. The second was that I would never again wait for my parents to decide I was worth something. That particular waiting was over. The first 2 years were the kind of hard that doesn't photograph well. Daniel and I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a building that had a broken elevator and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests on his own timeline, which is to say, eventually and insufficiently. Daniel was working full-time at the landscaping business by then, putting in 6-day weeks through spring and summer and picking up indoor work wherever he could find it through the winter months. I was waitressing 4 nights a week at a restaurant downtown while Rosa watched Ivy, and spending my days off applying to every scholarship and grant program I could find because I had not let go of the idea of college, not for a single day. I got into the nursing program at Lowcountry Technical College in the spring of the year Ivy turned 2. It took me 3 years instead of 2 because I could only manage part-time enrollment around work and Ivy's schedule, but I finished. I want you to understand that completing that degree was not a triumphant movie moment with swelling music and a proud family in the stands. It was a Tuesday morning in May, Daniel standing outside the building with Ivy on his hip because she was too young for the ceremony, me shaking the dean's hand and thinking mostly about whether I had enough gas to get home. That was enough. That was everything. Daniel and I got married the following October. Not a Fontaine wedding, not a reception at the Belhaven Country Club with 300 guests and a string quartet. We got married in Rosa's backyard on a Saturday afternoon with 30 people and a cake his sister made and a dress I bought secondhand and altered myself with a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed sewing machine. It was the best day of my life. I mean that without a single reservation. I sent my parents a wedding announcement. Standard card, no note. I'm not entirely sure why I sent it. Part of me, the part that never fully stopped being the girl who stood on that porch in the December cold, still wanted them to know. Still wanted them to see that I was real and present and building something without them. The announcement came back 3 weeks later. Return to sender. They had moved without leaving a forwarding address, which was either a coincidence or the most deliberate message they had ever sent me. I framed it. I genuinely framed the returned envelope and hung it in my home office, because if you are going to be haunted by something, you might as well look it in the face. By the time Ivy started kindergarten, I was working as a registered nurse at Belhaven Regional, the same hospital where she had been born. There is something I cannot fully explain about walking those halls every shift knowing that the worst night of my life had also been the best. It made the work feel like it meant something beyond the clinical. Every new mother I cared for, I thought about Rosa holding my hand. About what it had meant to have one person in that room who wanted me to be okay. My parents never sent a card when Ivy was born. Never acknowledged the wedding. Never reached out on birthdays or holidays or the 1,000 ordinary occasions that families use to maintain the thread between them. The silence from Wisteria Lane was total and consistent, and after a while I stopped measuring myself against it. Stopped checking the mailbox with that particular held breath feeling. Stopped doing the math of how many years it had been as if the number itself would eventually mean something. Life filled in around the absence the way it does. Daniel's family became my family in every way that mattered. Rosa came to every one of Ivy's school performances and kept her on Friday nights when Daniel and I needed to remember we were people and not just parents. Marisol became the sister I had never had in Colton. Her kids and Ivy grew up practically joined at the hip, spending summers running between the two apartments with a freedom that would have been unthinkable on Wisteria Lane. I was 31 when I got the first sign that the silence was ending. Not a phone call. Not a letter. A mutual acquaintance, a woman named Beverly Trask who had gone to First Presbyterian with my parents and whose daughter I had known vaguely in high school, sent me a Facebook message. Layla, I don't know if this is appropriate, but I thought you should know. Your mother has been telling people at church that you reconciled years ago. That you have a daughter she's close with. That you visit for the holidays. I read that message twice. Then I read it a third time. My mother had constructed an entire parallel reality in which the estrangement had quietly resolved itself, in which a grandchild existed in her life, in which the Fontaine family narrative had no wound in it at all. She hadn't just erased me. She had replaced me with a fiction of her own choosing, and she had been living inside that fiction long enough that the people around her had stopped questioning it. I thanked Beverly for telling me. I closed the message. I went back to making dinner and I did not say anything to Daniel that night because I needed to sit with what I had just learned before I could speak it out loud. My daughter was 12 years old. She had her father's eyes and my stubbornness and a laugh that could fill a room. She had never once met her maternal grandparents, and they had apparently decided that was a detail too inconvenient to carry. What I didn't know yet was that the reason my mother needed that fiction to be real was about to show up at my front door. And when it did, it was going to ask me for something I had no intention of giving. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late September when my mother knocked on my door. Not called. Not emailed. Knocked the way you do when you want to make it harder for someone to say no. I had just come off a 12-hour shift at Belhaven Regional. I was still in my scrubs. I had a cup of reheated coffee in my hand and approximately 0 emotional reserves left, which in retrospect was possibly the worst possible condition to be in when the woman who legally erased you at 18 shows up on your porch looking like she just came from lunch at the club. She looked older. Of course she did, 14 years is 14 years. But it wasn't just the lines around her eyes or the gray she had let grow into her hair in a way that looked deliberate rather than neglected. It was something in her posture. Patricia Fontaine had always carried herself like a woman who had never once been questioned. Standing on my porch that afternoon, she looked like a woman who had recently been questioned and hadn't fully recovered from the experience. My father was not with her. That detail registered immediately and I filed it away without yet knowing what to do with it. I stared at her through the screen door for what was probably 5 full seconds before either of us spoke. I was running a rapid internal inventory of every possible reason she could be standing there, and none of the options I generated in those 5 seconds were good. Layla. Her voice was the same. That was the thing that hit me hardest, standing there in my scrubs with my reheated coffee. Her voice was exactly the same. I did not open the screen door. I want you to understand that detail. I stood behind it and I looked at my mother through the mesh and I said, "What are you doing here?" Not a question. A statement with a question mark attached purely out of grammatical obligation. She asked if she could come in. I told her she could say what she needed to say from where she was standing. She flinched at that, a small tightening around the eyes, and then she said she had driven 2 hours to talk to me and could I please just give her 20 minutes. I let her in. I still have complicated feelings about that decision. Not because of what happened next, but because of what that moment revealed about me. After 14 years, one knock was still enough to get me to open the door. I have spent a lot of time thinking about what that says, and I have mostly made peace with the answer, which is that wanting your mother is not a weakness. It is just a very human thing that does not expire on schedule. She sat at my kitchen table. I did not offer her anything. I sat across from her and I waited. She started with small things, the way people do when they are working up to something larger. She mentioned that she had heard I was a nurse. That she was proud of me. I let that land without responding because I genuinely did not know what to do with Patricia Fontaine telling me she was proud of me in my own kitchen 14 years after she returned my wedding announcement unopened. Then she got to it. There was an event coming up, she said. My father's retirement celebration. 35 years at the firm. His partners were hosting a dinner at the Belhaven Country Club in November. 120 guests, people who had known the family for decades. And people had been asking about me. About us. About why the youngest Fontaine had been absent from every family event for the past 14 years. I have been telling people you were building your career, she said. That you were busy. That we were in touch. Her hands were folded on my kitchen table in that particular way she had, fingers laced, knuckles just slightly white. But lately the questions have become more specific. Someone saw your name on the staff listing at Belhaven Regional. Someone connected that to the Fontaine name. People talk in a town like this, Layla. You know that. I know that, I said. You taught me that. You taught me that was the most important thing in the world. She absorbed that without visibly reacting, which told me she had prepared herself for some version of this conversation on the drive up. Then she said the part that made the coffee cup in my hand suddenly feel very far away. I've told people about Ivy. I've mentioned her to a few of the partners' wives. Just in passing. Our granddaughter. She's 13 now, isn't she? Smart girl from what I understand. The silence that followed that statement was the loudest silence I have sat inside since the night my father nodded at my mother's verdict and went back to his newspaper. You have told people about Ivy, I said. Just in passing, she repeated. You told people you have a granddaughter. A granddaughter you have never met. A granddaughter whose birth you chose not to acknowledge. Whose existence you had your lawyer erase from any legal obligation before she was even born. My mother's jaw tightened. We were in a difficult position at the time. You were in a difficult position, I said. I was 18 years old and pregnant and standing on a porch in December with a duffel bag. That is not what I came here to relitigate, Layla. Then tell me why you came, I said. Hurry. She wanted Ivy at the retirement dinner. That was the bottom line, stripped of the preamble and the careful phrasing. She wanted to bring her granddaughter to her husband's retirement celebration so that the story she had been quietly telling, the one in which the Fontaine family was whole and functional and in possession of a granddaughter they adored, could have a face attached to it for one evening. She was willing to compensate me for my time and for any inconvenience the request might cause. She used the word compensate. To my face. In my kitchen. How much, I asked, because I wanted to hear the number. I wanted her to say it out loud. She named a figure. $15,000. For one evening. For Ivy to smile for photographs and call them Grandma and Grandpa and help my father's colleagues believe that the Fontaine family was everything they had always presented themselves to be. I set my coffee cup down very carefully on the table between us. Ivy does not know you, I said. She could get to know us. My mother leaned forward slightly. This could be the beginning of something, Layla. A relationship. A real one. We're older now. Your father and I have had time to reflect. People change. I thought about Ivy at 13. Fierce and funny and deeply, constitutionally allergic to anything that felt dishonest. A kid who had once written a 3-page letter to her school principal about the unfairness of a field trip policy and delivered it without being asked to. A kid who had grown up knowing the truth about her grandparents because I had promised her the truth and kept that promise every year as she was ready for more of it. My mother was asking me to take that child and place her in a room with 120 strangers and ask her to perform a relationship that had never existed. For $15,000. And the privilege of watching Patricia Fontaine receive compliments about what a lovely granddaughter she had. Does Ivy know about any of this? My mother asked. About the estrangement. She knows everything, I said. My mother's expression shifted in a way I had not seen before. Not the hardening I was used to. Something more like the look of a person who has just realized the terrain they are standing on is not as solid as they assumed. Everything, I repeated. She's known since she was old enough to understand it. I told her the truth. I told her about the papers your lawyer drew up before she was born. I told her that you told your friends she'd been given up for adoption. She knows all of it. So if you are imagining a version of this evening where Ivy walks in not knowing who you are or what you did, that version does not exist. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Outside, I could hear the neighbors' kids riding bikes up and down the street, the ordinary soundtrack of a Wednesday afternoon. Then she said something that surprised me. Not because it was generous or self-aware, but because it revealed how clearly she understood the position she was in and had decided to push forward anyway. I know we don't deserve her. I know we don't deserve you. But your father is retiring, Layla. This is the last significant thing, the last event that matters to him in this way. And I am asking you as your mother to consider giving us this one thing. As my mother. He said that. As my mother. I stood up. She looked up at me and for just a moment she looked genuinely uncertain, which on Patricia Fontaine was as close to afraid as I had ever seen. I'm going to need you to leave, I said. I'm going to think about what you've said. But I need you to leave my house right now before I say something that makes thinking about it impossible. She gathered her bag. She stood. At the door she turned and there was something in her face that I could not entirely name, something that lived in the border territory between remorse and strategy, and I genuinely could not tell you which one was driving it. I'll be in touch, she said. I closed the door. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after her car pulled out of the driveway, just standing there in my scrubs with my cold coffee, listening to the bikes outside. Then I called Daniel. He picked up on the second ring the way he always does. And when I told him what had just happened, the silence on his end lasted exactly long enough for me to know that whatever came next, we were going to have to be very, very careful. Because my mother had not driven 2 hours and offered $15,000 without a plan behind it. And if there was one thing Patricia Fontaine had always been, in all the years I had known her and all the years I had been trying to outrun her version of our story, it was prepared. Daniel came home that evening with the particular quietness he carries when he is thinking hard about something he does not yet want to say. He set his keys on the counter, washed his hands and sat down at the kitchen table where my mother had been sitting 3 hours earlier, and I watched him look at that chair for a second longer than necessary before he looked at me. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. I went through all of it, the white linen blazer, the retirement dinner, the 120 guests, the partners' wives she had been casually mentioning Ivy to for what sounded like at least a year. The $15,000. Is my mother. I laid it all out on the table between us, and when I finished, Daniel was quiet for a long time, turning his wedding ring slowly around his finger the way he does when he is working something out. He's not getting near Ivy, he said finally. That is not a discussion we are having. I know, I said. He looked at me. Do you? And that was the real question, wasn't it? Because Daniel knows me. He has known me since I was 17 years old, crying in the parking lot of a gas station on Merchant Street. And he knows the specific way Patricia Fontaine occupies space in my head even after all these years, even after everything I have built and everything I have become. He knows that the part of me that opened the screen door that afternoon is the same part that sent the wedding announcement, the same part that has never fully stopped grieving the mother I needed her to be and never was. I know, I said again, and this time I meant it differently. We did not tell Ivy that night. She was at Rose's, had been since after school, and we made the mutual unspoken decision to give ourselves 24 hours before we brought her into it. Not to protect her from information, we had never done that, but to make sure that when we talked to her we had actually decided what we thought rather than just handed her our unprocessed panic and called it a conversation. What I did that night instead was go to the fireproof box at the back of my closet shelf. I had not opened it in probably 4 years. Inside was the disinheritance document, 3 pages, notarized, the legal language still sharp and cold as the December night it had been drafted to commemorate. I read it again from the first line to the last, including the clause about any child I might bring into the world, and then I photographed every page and uploaded them to my cloud storage and made 2 additional backup copies on separate drives because I had learned from 14 years of living with this document that the things you might need to prove are exactly the things you have to protect most carefully. I also pulled out Colton's text from December of that year, the one about the gap year and the photography program in Europe. I had screenshotted it years ago when I got a new phone, had kept it in a folder I labeled Miscellaneous Family, the way you label things when you are not ready to name what they actually are. I looked at it for a long time. Then I added it to the backup folder. I did not know yet exactly what I was going to do. But I knew that whatever it was, I was not going to be caught without documentation. Patricia Fontaine had a lawyer on speed dial and a 35-year investment in the Fontaine family story, and if she had driven 2 hours and offered $15,000 as an opening position, she was not going to accept a quiet no and drive back to Belhaven and let the matter rest. 2 days later I was right. My phone rang at 7 in the morning with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Warren Cahill, attorney at law, calling on behalf of Gerald and Patricia Fontaine regarding a family matter he believed I was already aware of. I sat down on the edge of my bed. Mr. Cahill explained in the measured tones of a man who bills by the hour and has learned to make everything sound procedural, that his clients were reaching out in the spirit of reconciliation and were prepared to formalize their offer in writing. $15,000 in exchange for my attendance and Ivy's attendance at the November retirement dinner, with an additional provision for ongoing contact between Ivy and her maternal grandparents going forward, contact to be structured according to terms we could negotiate. Ongoing contact, I said. That is correct. A visitation framework, potentially. Something that would allow Ivy to develop a relationship with the Fontaines in a way that felt comfortable for all parties. Mr. Cahill, I said, I want to make sure I understand what you are telling me. My parents have retained legal counsel to negotiate access to a child they legally disclaimed before she was born. He paused. I would characterize it as a good faith effort to establish a family relationship that has unfortunately been interrupted. It has not been interrupted, I said. It has never existed. And I need you to understand something. Whatever my parents have told you about the nature of this estrangement, I have the original disinheritance documents they had drafted in December. I have corroborating evidence of the false narrative they have been presenting to their social circle for 14 years. And I have a 13-year-old daughter who knows the full history and is not, under any circumstances, available to perform a family reunion for the benefit of a retirement dinner. I said good morning, Mr. Cahill, and I ended the call. I sat on the edge of my bed for another minute. Then I called my brother. Colton and I had maintained a thin and careful thread of contact over the years. Birthday texts, the occasional email. Nothing that resembled closeness, but also nothing that had fully severed. He was a family attorney himself now, which I had always found either ironic or entirely predictable depending on my mood. And he lived 2 hours south of Belhaven with a wife and 3 kids I had met exactly once at a cousin's wedding 6 years ago. He picked up on the third ring. When I told him about the visit and the attorney call, he was quiet in a different way than Daniel had been quiet. Daniel's silence is protective. Colton's silence is the sound of a man calculating how much he already knew and deciding how much to admit. Did you know about this? I asked. Not the lawyer, he said. Mom mentioned the retirement dinner. She mentioned she was hoping to reach out to you. I didn't know she'd already gone to your house. And the money offer? Did you know about that? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. She mentioned she wanted to make it worth your while. I didn't know the specific number. I closed my eyes. Colton, I said, are you going to stand on the landing again? He knew exactly what I meant. The upstairs landing. December. The light going out. The silence this time was longer. I could hear him breathing. No, he said. I'm not. What do you need? I need to know if you are willing to tell the truth about what happened the night they threw me out. Not to me. I know the truth. I need to know if you are willing to say it to other people if it comes to that. He exhaled. Yes. Whatever you need. I should have said it a long time ago. I thanked him and got off the phone. One piece. Now I needed to tell Ivy. She was doing homework at the kitchen table when I sat down across from her that evening. Daniel was at the counter, not pretending to do anything else, just present, which is one of the things I love most about him. Ivy looked up at me with that particular expression she has, the one that means she already knows something is coming and has decided to wait it out rather than ask. Your grandmother came to see me, I said. Ivy set down her pencil. Patricia Fontaine? The same. What did she want? So I told her. I told her about the retirement dinner and the 120 guests and the story her grandmother had been telling about a granddaughter she knew and loved. I told her about the $15,000. I told her about Warren Cahill and the visitation framework. I watched my daughter's face as she processed each piece, that careful, unreadable expression she maintains when she is deciding how to feel about something before she allows herself to feel it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she's been telling people she knows me. Yes. For how long? I don't know exactly. At least a year based on what Beverly Trask told me. Ivy picked her pencil back up and turned it slowly in her fingers. So she invented a version of me. The way she invented a version of you going to Europe. I hadn't connected those two things out loud before, but sitting across from my 13-year-old daughter in my kitchen, I felt the full weight of the pattern. Patricia Fontaine did not erase people. She replaced them. She constructed substitute versions that behaved the way she needed them to and slotted them into her narrative and then maintained those versions with the same disciplined consistency she brought to everything else in her life. The daughter who went abroad. The granddaughter she adored. Two fictions. Both of them built on the grave of something real. What are you going to do? Ivy asked. I looked at her, this kid who had her father's eyes and my stubbornness and had just, at 13 years old, articulated the core of my mother's pathology with more precision than I had managed in 34 years. I'm going to say no, I said. To the dinner, to the money, to all of it. Ivy nodded slowly. And then what? I looked at Daniel. He looked back at me. And I realized that the answer to that question was not yet fully formed, but the shape of it was starting to become clear. Because saying no was only the first part. The second part was making sure that the no actually meant something. That it had weight. That it could not simply be absorbed into the Fontaine narrative and replaced with yet another version of events that served my mother's purposes. That, it turned out, was going to require a different kind of conversation entirely. And it was going to happen somewhere my mother could not control. The retirement dinner was on a Friday evening in the second week of November. I know this because my mother called me personally 4 days before it to deliver what she clearly intended as a final appeal, and what actually functioned as a confirmation that she had run out of other options. She did not mention Warren Cahill. She did not mention the visitation framework or the $15,000. She spoke as though none of that had happened, as though we were simply two people who had lost touch and were now attempting to find their way back to each other. And if her voice carried a particular controlled urgency underneath the pleasantness, she was disciplined enough not to let it fully surface. Layla, she said, your father is 63 years old. He has given 35 years to that firm. This dinner is the last time these people will gather for him in this way. Whatever happened between us, whatever you feel about me, your father deserves to have his family there. I noticed the framing. Whatever happened between us. Passive construction, no subject, no verb, no agent. Things had simply happened the way weather happens or traffic happens, without anyone making choices or anyone bearing responsibility for the consequences of those choices. I let her finish. Then I said, Mom, I sent you a wedding announcement 14 years ago. You returned it without opening it. I want you to think about that while you talk to me about what my father deserves. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly toward something that sounded less rehearsed. I made mistakes, Layla. I know I made mistakes. What specifically? I said. Name one. The silence lasted long enough that I thought she might actually do it, might reach back 14 years and pull out one specific concrete thing and call it what it was. But in the end what she said was, I handled things badly when you told us about the pregnancy. I know that. Handled things badly, I repeated. You called your lawyer the same night. You had papers drawn up. You told your friends and your church and your garden club that your daughter had given her baby up for adoption. For 14 years. You named a fiction and you maintained it and you invited everyone around you to believe it. That is not handling things badly. That is a sustained and deliberate campaign to make two people disappear, and one of those people is 13 years old and has never done a single thing to you. She did not respond to that. She said she hoped I would reconsider and she said goodbye, and that was the last time we spoke before the dinner. I had already made my decision. I was not going to the retirement dinner. Ivy was not going either. But I was not going to let my father's retirement pass without the truth finding its way into that room. Patricia Fontaine had spent 14 years managing the narrative from a distance, feeding just enough fiction to the right people to keep the Fontaine image intact, and she had done it so efficiently that no one in their circle had ever pushed back hard enough to make it cost her anything. I intended to change that. 3 days before the dinner I wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, a physical letter, 4 pages handwritten on plain paper, addressed to Gerald Fontaine's senior partner, a man named Robert Aldrich who had been with the firm for 28 years and who by everything I had ever heard from my parents was the closest thing my father had to a genuine friend in his professional life. I told Robert Aldrich the truth. All of it, in order, from the December night through the disinheritance papers, through 14 years of silence, through my mother showing up on my porch with a checkbook and a story about reconciliation she had not earned. I was careful about my tone. I was not writing a grievance, I was writing a record. A clear, documented account of what had happened, set down by the person it had happened to, for the consideration of one person who I believed would know what to do with it. I included photocopies of the disinheritance documents, all 3 pages. I included a screenshot of Colton's text about the gap year and the photography program in Europe. I included a brief note from Colton confirming that he had been present the night of the expulsion and that what I described was accurate. 3 pieces of paper that together told a story my parents could not plausibly dispute because they had generated 2 of them personally. I mailed it certified mail, signature required. The same method my father had used to deliver my own erasure 14 years before. I wanted him to understand when he eventually learned about the letter, as I knew he would, that I recognized the weight of documented evidence delivered with deliberate intention. That I had learned something from him after all, just not the lesson he had intended to teach. Daniel sat with it for a moment when I told him and then asked, "Are you okay with how this might land?" Not whether I had done the right thing. Not whether it would work. Just whether I was okay. That is the question of a person who has known you for 14 years and understands that doing the right thing and being okay with it are not always the same event. "Think so," I said. I needed to stop letting the truth live only inside this house. The dinner was on a Friday. I know what happened because Colton called me Saturday morning. Robert Aldrich had pulled my father aside before the dinner began. Colton did not hear the conversation, but he saw it, saw the 2 of them standing in the corridor outside the banquet room, saw his father's face cycle through something that was not the expression of a man receiving ordinary news. My father straightened, nodded, and followed Robert back into the room, and spent the rest of the evening doing what Gerald Fontaine had always done when something threatened his composure. He performed composure so completely it became indistinguishable from the real thing unless you knew where to look. My mother spent the evening watching my father watch the room. She knew something had shifted and she did not know what or how much, and not knowing was costing her in a way that showed around the edges of her smile. 3 of my father's partners asked about me during the dinner. One woman who had joined the firm recently and carried no loyalty to the established mythology asked my father directly whether it was true he had a daughter at Belhaven Regional. He said yes. She asked why she had never met me at firm events. He said they had a complicated relationship and that he hoped to repair it. Complicated relationship. Colton said those words to me on the phone and went quiet. I did not react. Complicated relationship was the predictable evolution of handled things badly, another passive construction built to carry information without carrying responsibility. But here is what my mother had not accounted for. Complicated relationship spoken in a room where Robert Aldrich is sitting with 4 photocopied pages of a notarized disinheritance document does not land the same way it would have the week before. People can feel when a story does not fully hold even when they cannot name the thing that sits wrong inside it. My father called me Sunday morning. Not my mother. My father. I had not heard his voice in 14 years. He sounded older in a way that was not just time but something beneath it, the particular weight of a man who has been performing the same story for too long and has finally felt the room stop believing it. He said he thought it might be time for them to talk, he and I, without lawyers and without your mother present. He used that phrase deliberately. I noticed it and filed it away. I told him I was open to a conversation. On my terms. My time. And that if he had any intention of turning it into a negotiation about Ivy it would end before it started. He said he understood. I held the phone a long time after we hung up. Then I went to find Ivy in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball against the fence with the focused quiet rhythm she uses when she is working through something she is not ready to name. I sat on the back steps and watched her until she came and sat beside me and I told her your grandfather called. She turned the tennis ball in her hands. Are you going to talk to him? I don't know yet, I said honestly. She nodded. Just let me know what you decide. Then she leaned her head briefly against my shoulder in that understated way she has and went back inside. What I had not told Ivy was that I had also sent a copy of the letter to Beverly Trask, the woman from First Presbyterian who had messaged me a year earlier about my mother's invented reconciliation story. Beverly called me Monday, careful and measured the way Southern women of a certain generation are careful and measured when they are quietly furious. She said she had already spoken to 2 other women from the church circle who had also been receiving Patricia's version of our relationship for years. She was not alarming me, she said. She was making sure I understood the full shape of what my mother had built and how many people were now holding a very different version of the map. I thanked her. I meant it completely. My mother had spent 14 years managing the story. What she had not accounted for was the moment the people inside it started comparing notes. And I have raised, against every odd and with more grace extended to me than I deserved, an extraordinary person. Whatever my parents intended when they signed those papers and mailed them to an 18-year-old girl, they do not get credit for her. Not one single day. That belongs entirely to us. My father and I met for coffee on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the retirement dinner. Not in Belhaven. Halfway between, at a diner off the interstate in a town called Harwick that neither of us had any history with, which felt right. Neutral ground for a conversation that had no neutral version. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a mug, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and was no longer certain any of it applied. He stood when he saw me come through the door. I did not hug him. I sat down across from him and ordered coffee, and we looked at each other for a moment across the laminate table, and I thought, this is the first time I have been in the same room as my father in 14 years, and I feel remarkably calm. He started by saying he had read the letter I sent Robert. Not a copy. Robert had shown him the original, had placed it on the table between them the evening of the retirement dinner and given him time to read it before saying a single word. My father said that reading it had been one of the most difficult experiences of his life. I let that statement exist without validating it because difficult for him and what it had described were not the same category of difficult. He said he wanted to explain his thinking at the time. What followed was not a defense, or at least he was honest enough not to frame it as one. He said he had been afraid. Not of me, not of the pregnancy itself, but of my mother. He said Patricia had managed the image of the Fontaine family with a grip so complete that by the time I was born he had long since stopped being a participant in the decisions and become an executor of them. When she had made her position clear that December night, he had done what he had done for 30 years of marriage, which was agree. I looked at him for a long time after he said that. Then I said, "You were 63 years old at the dinner last month and you still introduced me to your colleagues as a complicated relationship. So I want to understand at what point in the last 14 years fear of my mother stopped being the explanation and started being the excuse." He did not answer that immediately. He looked at his coffee. When he looked back up, his eyes were the eyes of a man who had stopped performing. He said, "You're right. I know that. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I want to be clear about that. I am sitting here because I needed you to know that I am aware of what I did and what I failed to do, and those are not the same thing, and both of them were wrong." That was the most honest thing my father had ever said to me. I believe that completely. I also believe it came 14 years too late and arrived only because a letter to his business partner had made silence no longer a viable option. Both of those things can be true simultaneously and neither one cancels out the other. I told him I was not going to make decisions about our relationship in a diner off the interstate. Whatever happened going forward would happen slowly and on terms that Ivy and I set, not terms driven by what was convenient for anyone else. He said he understood. He asked if he could ask one question. I said yes. He asked if Ivy knew he existed as a person rather than just as a fact in our history. "She knows you exist," I said. "Whether she ever wants to know you beyond that is entirely her decision, and I will not influence it in either direction." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else and then decided against it, which was possibly the most self-aware thing I had ever witnessed him do. We left the diner 40 minutes after we arrived. He walked to his car and I walked to mine, and we did not make plans and we did not promise anything, and that honesty felt more respectful than any amount of performed warmth would have. My mother never asked for a meeting. She called twice in the weeks after the dinner, short calls, careful, nothing that demanded very much. On the second call she said she had told her garden club the truth. Not all of it. Just that we had been estranged and that it had been her fault. She said Beverly Trask had already told 2 people and Patricia Fontaine had never allowed someone else to control her narrative if she could get there first. I actually laughed at that. She did too, briefly, and it was the strangest sound I had heard in a very long time, my mother's laugh, unchanged across 14 years. Colton came to visit in December with his wife and 3 kids, the first time he had been in my home. His youngest, a 7-year-old named Petra, attached herself to Ivy within 15 minutes and followed her around the house for the entire afternoon like she had been waiting her whole life for this. Watching them, I felt something I did not have an immediate word for. Not forgiveness. Something closer to the recognition that some of what had been lost could not be recovered and some of it, imperfectly, might still be rebuilt. Colton and I sat on the back steps and talked for 2 hours in a way we had never talked as children, honestly and without performance, about what it had been like growing up in that house and the damage that comes from being raised to believe reputation is the same thing as character. He cried once and I let him without reassuring him it was fine, because it was not fine, but I did not walk away either. In January, Ivy came to me one evening and said she wanted to write Patricia a letter. Not to reconcile, she said quickly, and not because she had forgiven anything, but because she had things she needed to say and did not want to carry them her whole life without saying them, and writing felt safer than a meeting she was not ready for. I told her that was one of the wisest decisions I had ever heard her make. She spent 3 evenings on it and did not show it to me before she sent it, which was also the right call. My mother called after she received it. She said she had read it 4 times and every line was exactly what she deserved. She said my daughter wrote like someone who had been raised to believe her words mattered. I said yes. She asked who had taught her that. I said she had mostly taught herself, but Rosa had shown her early what it looked like when someone treated your presence as a gift rather than a problem. There was a long silence after that. Then my mother said, I should have been that for you. I said yes. You should have. And we stayed on the line without speaking for another minute, the way you do when the silence has already said everything better than words could. I am 34 years old. I have a husband who has answered the phone on the second ring for 14 years. I have a daughter who writes letters to people who hurt her because she refuses to become someone who swallows her own truth. I have a mother-in-law who put flower-covered hands on my shoulders in a doorway on a December night, and that one gesture outweighed every deliberate cruelty the Fontaines had managed in 18 years combined. My parents are still my parents. That fact does not require me to minimize what they did or pretend the damage was smaller than it was. What it requires is that I decide on my own terms what their presence in my life looks like going forward. That decision is mine. It has always been mine. It just took me 14 years and 1 letter sent certified mail to a man named Robert Aldrich to fully understand that. If you have been carrying someone else's version of your story, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to take it back. You do not need their permission. You do not need an audience or a confrontation or a perfect moment. You just need to decide that the truth belongs to you and then refuse quietly and completely to let anyone convince you otherwise. That is not a happy ending, but it is an honest one. And honest is the only kind I know how to offer. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confire Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.